screen with his presentation. Okay, Bob Naeye was, correct me if I've got the wrong position, Bob, formerly the editor-in-chief, is that correct?
That is correct.
Editor-in-chief of Sky and Telescope magazine, and is now billing himself as a science journalist to great effect, I'm sure. And he has talked to GAAC several times in the past, all really good, smart, and interesting talks. And we're really glad to have him here with us tonight. I need to tell you that Bob turned me on to a woman named Patricia Stratt, who ran a labeled release experiment on the Viking craft on Mars and got positive results out of it, which NASA never followed up on. And she's written a book about it. And maybe Bob will talk a little bit about this during his presentation.
Yep.
But she's our speaker for our holiday party, December 11th.
And I'll want to tune into that.
Yeah, that's gonna be another keeper, just like the one tonight. All right, Bob, it's all yours.
Okay, great.
Wait a minute, Bob. I'm going to mute everybody and then I'm going to unmute you, okay?
Okay. Can you still hear me?
There you go. All right.
Are we good to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay, everybody can hear me okay? Nod your head if you can hear me. Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank Mike for setting up the Zoom meeting, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in tonight. I mean, where I live in Pennsylvania, it's nice and clear, pretty warm. Mars is out right now, so I appreciate you tuning in, and it's really great to reconnect with GAAC, even though it's virtual. You know, I really miss attending the GAAC meetings up and visiting Cape Ann. I hope everyone's staying in good health during the pandemic. I think as some of you know, I'm currently living just outside Hershey, Pennsylvania. Go Chocolate Town, PA. I'm still writing about astronomy, but I'm also writing for several local publications on a wide variety of topics, including music, politics, beer, and Vietnam veterans, and other topics. So I haven't been back to Massachusetts since I moved here in 2016, but one of these days I'm going to get there, and when I do, I hope to see many of you, and I'll certainly pay a visit to Gloucester. So my talk tonight is based on the cover story that I wrote for the September 2020 issue of Astronomy magazine, and I also wrote an accompanying internet article. So if you find tonight's talk interesting, I recommend checking out these articles. And I do want to just thank my editors at Astronomy magazine, Allison and Rich, and the staff. You know, they asked me to write the article, and then I thought they did a very nice job preparing the article for publication. So my topic tonight is, you know, about how scientists are looking for life on other worlds. And of course, that raises the question of the prevalence and nature of extraterrestrial life. And, you know, scientists have discussed these topics for centuries. And you can see here, you know, this is ET. The public is very interested in this topic too. You know, movies that have alien creatures like Avatar and Star Wars, Star Trek, ET are among the most popular movies ever made. And then we have this, you know, the, you know, science fiction TV series too. So, but, you know, I would contend that despite all of this interest and speculation, I liken astrobiology to string theory. I hope we don't have any string theorists on this webinar. And what I mean by that is that astrobiology is a science whose subject matter has not yet been proven to exist, just like string theory. So what I want to see is to turn astrobiology into an observational science, which means we need to find out who and what is out there. So, you know, scientists have good reasons to be optimistic that life is common in our galaxy and universe. For example, geologists have found chemical evidence, you know, carbon isotope ratios in ancient rocks from Greenland, like the one we see in this picture here. You know, some of these rocks date back to 3.8 billion years, which are, you know, the oldest rocks we have. They come from a time not long after the planet formed and went through a heavy bombardment. So we still don't know exactly when or how or where life started, but we do know that it started early in Earth's history. So that gives, reason for optimism that if conditions are right, meaning the presence of liquid water, organic molecules, and the flow of energy, that life is going to get going. And, obviously we have a huge number of stars in our Milky Way galaxy, somewhere around 200 billion. And we know now from the exoplanet surveys that there's an average of at least one planet per star. So we're talking several hundred billion planets in our galaxy alone, perhaps maybe even a trillion. And then if you include moons, the number of potentially life-bearing worlds in our galaxy is literally astronomical. And then here we see a picture of the Orion Nebula. I'm sure all of you have seen this. This is where stars are forming inside these molecular interstellar clouds. These clouds are brimming. That's a Carl Sagan word, by the way. He liked that word. They're brimming with elements such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, that are all essential to life on Earth. So the good news here is that, life, or our galaxy is richly endowed with the ingredients for life, at least as we know it. Like if it was made up of like plutonium and beryllium, which are, are elements that are very rare, that would be kind of like a downer. But, the elements that are most common in the universe are what makes up life on Earth. But, it's dangerous to draw conclusions from just a single example of a phenomenon. We don't really know. I mean, maybe the origin of life on Earth was a once in a universe miracle that's never happened or been repeated elsewhere. Maybe we're incredibly lucky that as Earth has gone through profound changes in its geology and atmospheric content, surface conditions, etc., throughout all of this, over 3.5 billion years, life has managed to continue. So it's gone from single cell life to multicellular life to complex plants and animals. Is that common or, unique to Earth? We can't answer these questions just from one planet. We have to find other life to really understand this. So as my Astronomy magazine article explains, scientists are taking 3 roads or approaches to the search for extraterrestrial life. So imagine this road on the left is exploring the solar system up close with robots, maybe future human sample return. The slide number 2 here, or the road number 2, is exoplanets. Probing the atmospheres of planets orbiting other stars. And then the third one, and the most fun, is SETI and the search for what we'll call technosignatures, looking for signs of technology out there in space. I want to emphasize, it's not like this is a race or a competition. We don't know how common life is, or what it's like, so it's impossible to predict how soon we'll make the first detection of life on another world or how it will be made. So I think that it's smart to try different avenues and see which one bears fruit. I am getting more optimistic though, because our space missions are getting better, telescopes are getting better. So if life is relatively common, I'm 57, maybe we'll get the first detection in my lifetime, maybe even within the next 10 to 20 years. We'll see. But, I just want to talk real briefly about what is it that we're looking for? What is life? And this question does not have a simple answer. I mean, I've read different books and articles. I've never seen a common definition that everybody agrees to. And on Earth, we see an incredible variety of life just on our own planet. And we know, for example, that microbes can exist in acidic hot springs or dry, cold Antarctic valleys. They can exist in pores and deep underground rocks, a mile or more underground, or even at the crushing pressures of the deep ocean. And then if we consider more complex life, like you see in this slide, Even animals and plants possess an incredible range of forms and fill many different environmental niches. And then when we think about life on other worlds, that's a huge unknown. I mean, there's got to be, life supporting environments on other worlds that are totally unlike anything we have on Earth. So scientists need to be broad-minded in their thinking about extraterrestrial life. And given our ignorance about the possible range of life forms that could be out there, we can't resolve any of these questions about extraterrestrial life through calculations or theoretical speculations. We got to explore and observe, and so that's what I'll be discussing over the next half hour. Now, I want to start this next part of my talk, as some of you might be thinking, well, didn't scientists recently announce the discovery of life on Venus? Okay, so I'm sure all of you remember this. Just a few weeks ago in mid-September, an international team of astronomers, including Sarah Seeger at MIT, someone you might want to try to get as a speaker, they announced the detection of the molecule phosphine, pH3, in Venus's thick atmosphere. So this slide here shows two different telescopes got spectra of phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, and it's superimposed on an image of Venus. Well, I want to emphasize, and Sarah Seeger said this during the press conference, the team is not claiming that it detected life on Venus. What they're saying is they detected phosphine at a pretty high confidence level, although even that is not totally certain. They only have one wavelength. It's trace levels, but enough that it produced, a pretty strong signature. What they're saying is we can't think of any known chemical processes occurring in the atmosphere of Venus that could produce phosphine. And they also said on Earth, there's trace amounts of phosphine in Earth's atmosphere. It's all biological. It either comes from microbes or from human industrial activity. So what they're saying is we've got this phosphine. We don't know where it's coming from. It comes from a layer in the atmosphere about 30 to 40 miles above the surface that has the right temperatures and pressures to sustain life as we know it. But that layer appears to have like little or no water, and the clouds at that layer are made of sulfuric acid. Pretty nasty stuff. So if it is life, if it is microbes, it's very different from life we have on Earth. So we're going to need more observations, probably eventually more missions to Venus to resolve the origin of its atmospheric phosphine. So I'm neutral. It might be life, might not. We don't know yet. We need more missions. So I want to start off now by talking about Mars, which of course very periodically comes very close to Earth, making it relatively easy for amateurs to observe and get great pictures like the one we see on the left, and also reach with spacecraft. And I know many of you are right now taking really great images of Mars. But for very long stretches of history, of course, many people like Percival Lowell assumed that Mars was inhabited by vegetation or even intelligent beings. And it's, stimulated a lot of imaginative science fiction. But NASA missions to Mars in the late 60s and 70s disabused humanity of these notions. The surface is cold, dry, barren, and lacking any obvious signs of life. But look at these orbiter photos from the 70s. They show, channels that look suspiciously like those carved by streams and rivers on Earth. Now, a lot more recent exploration, especially from the rovers, NASA's rovers, I think have demonstrated beyond all doubt that liquid water once flowed across Mars's surface. And on Earth, wherever you have water, you also have life. So in 1976, NASA landed 2 Viking landers. They were on opposite sides of the planet, about 4,000 miles apart, and they were the first successful landings on Mars. We see a spare Viking lander on the left, And on the right is an image from Viking 1. That big boulder is called Big Joe, and we can be very glad that Viking 1 did not land on top of Big Joe. So Viking and Patricia Ann Stratt will talk much more about this in December, but both spacecraft carried mechanical arms that scooped up soil samples or material from the ground, brought it inside the lander, and conducted a series of experiments, basically seeing you add things like nutrients and water. Do you get metabolism? Like, do they start exhale? Are there Martian microbes exhaling gas, that from metabolism? And as we discussed earlier, one of the experiments called the labeled release experiment came up with results that by all the pre-mission criteria were positive. If you're interested in this topic, go to her website, To Mars with Love, great title, and that's the title of her book, .com. Now, I also asked one of the world's leading astrobiologists, Chris McKay of NASA Ames, who's also a great popularizer, and he said it's quite possible their discovery detected life. However, the experiment to detect organic molecules came up negative. So a lot of scientists are saying, well, they detected a reactive chemical in the Martian soil, but since Viking, some of NASA's rovers have actually detected organics in the soil. So from my point of view, it's an open question. We don't know whether Viking detected life on Mars back in 1976. And I'm disappointed that NASA has never since sent a dedicated life detection experiment to Mars to follow up these tantalizing results. I want to mention too, I'm sure many of you remember this, go back 1996, that's when I was working at Astronomy Magazine. A team of NASA and Stanford scientists did chemical and microscopic analysis of this Martian meteorite called ALH 84001, and they found chemical signatures and these tiny little structures that they said could be evidence that there was once life inside this rock when it was on Mars long time ago, probably billions of years ago. The problem is that all of the signs of life that they can point to can also be explained through non-biological processes. So most scientists right now think probably did not, we can't say this is conclusive evidence of ancient life on Mars, but I would say it also hasn't been refuted either. It's kind of just hanging out there. More interesting and more recent is that both telescopic observations from Earth and measurements on the surface of Mars from NASA's Curiosity rover have detected trace amounts of methane, CH4, in Mars's very thin atmosphere. Even more interesting, the level rises and falls with the seasons. On Earth, 95% of methane in Earth's atmosphere has a biological origin, but there are still chemical and geological processes that could be occurring on Mars that could be producing this methane. So the origin of the methane remains unresolved, but pretty darn interesting. And more recently, Curiosity has detected trace levels of oxygen, O2, in the atmosphere, and it rises and falls more or less in tandem with the methane. Rises in the summer, declines in the fall and winter. Once again, on Earth, like pretty much all the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere is coming from biology, especially photosynthesis, but there's other ways of producing oxygen. So once again, this is unknown, the origin, but it's tantalizing. I mean, here we have two potential biomarkers telling us there could be life on Mars. So a couple months ago, July 30th, NASA launched its next rover to Mars. Very nice artist rendition here, known as Perseverance, although the scientists generally just call it Percy for short. So it's going to land or crash, hopefully land, on February 18th next year. It's inside a crater called Jezero Crater. This is kind of a false color image from orbit of its landing area. And you can see it looks like an ancient river delta. So Percy should be encountering a lot of rocks that formed in liquid water. Now, it does not carry, once again, NASA's being conservative, does not carry a specific life detection experiment, but it could theoretically detect minerals. There's a whole series of minerals on Earth that would not exist without biology. So it could conceivably detect minerals, but more importantly, and I think this is really important, it's going to collect rock and soil samples, cache them, and then in the early 2030s, NASA and the European Space Agency are planning to fly a mission. NASA's going to send a rover, come down, land very close to the Curiosity or the Percy site, collect those samples, put them in a rocket, launch it into orbit, and then there's a European mission that'll collect those samples in orbit and then send them back to Earth and return them to Earth so they can be studied in a class 4 very high secure laboratories on Earth, and we can study this material in detail. So if there's life on Mars, past or present, this mission could resolve the issue. Jim Bell, one of this Percy science team members, told me when I was writing the astronomy article, he said that he will not regard Perseverance's mission to be complete until its samples are brought back to Earth. In the meantime, the European Space Agency is planning its own Mars rover, named after Rosalind Franklin, we see here in this slide, who people forget about her, but it was her work with X-ray imaging in the early 50s that made it possible for Watson and Crick to discover the double helix structure of DNA. So ESA was originally going to launch Rosalind Franklin earlier this year, but they ran into problems testing its parachute, and then we had the pandemic hit, so they postponed the launch until late 2022. So we're going to have to wait a while for it to land, but it's also going to land in an ancient Martian lake bed. It's going to carry a suite of cameras, spectrometers, and a drill, and it can drill down up to 2 meters, about 6.5 feet, and it's going to bring material on board. They're going to crush the material into a powder and heat it up, kind of like Viking, and going to do a series of experiments looking for organic compounds and biosignatures of past or current life. So if Mars has life or had it in the past, the Europeans could beat NASA to the punch. If these missions, these robotic missions, can't resolve the life question, it might require human exploration, human explorers who can dig down into underground aquifers or hydrothermal areas or other areas that are thought most likely to harbor life. So it might require a sustained human presence to determine if Earth or Mars is a living or dead planet. And I picked this artwork because I really like having these little kids in the picture. Now here we see an astronaut finding a plant. I don't think that's likely. If there's life, it's probably microbial. But finding life on Mars would be an incredible discovery. If it turns out that Martian life has some kind of evolutionary linkage to terrestrial life, that could imply that life originated on one planet and was transported to another, perhaps inside a meteorite like ALH 84001, or that both planets were seeded from a common outside source. That would be an incredibly interesting discovery. But let's say Mars is like totally unrelated to Earth life. Maybe for genetics, it uses a molecule different from DNA, for example. that would tell us that life started independently on two different planets. That in turn would imply, with all the billions and billions of worlds in the galaxy, I think that would tell us that we live in a galaxy just chock full of life, even if we just knew about life on two planets. Okay, so I now want to turn my attention to the icy moons of the outer solar system, and we're going to start with Jupiter's fourth largest moon, Europa, the smallest of the four Galilean moons, which I've arrowed here. Now on the left, this is actually a Galileo image, but the two Voyager spacecraft that flew by Europa in 1979 and 80 saw that it was crisscrossed with these dark features, these lines, the density implied, bulk density, that there is a thick layer of liquid water, just a lot of evidence that there could be water, a water ocean lying beneath the moon's icy surface. You'll notice there's one impact crater, but virtually no craters on the surface. So then NASA put an orbiter around Jupiter in 1995 called Galileo, and it made numerous close flybys of Europa. Here we see a really incredible detail. This is a color-coded image. What you see in this image, it looks like ice rafts that are floating around on top of a watery layer. They also discovered that Europa has what's called an induced magnetic field, which implies a subsurface ocean with a lot of salt. And very intriguingly, the spectrometers discovered organic material on the surface of Europa. So here we see a model of the interior, and they've discovered, both with Galileo archival data, but also with Hubble Space Telescope data, there are water-rich plumes shooting out into space from Europa. So there's abundant evidence of a thick ocean of water on Europa. The water is certainly in contact, or almost certainly in contact, with a rocky layer beneath it. And the total volume of water in Europa's ocean probably greatly exceeds the total volume of water in all the oceans on Earth combined. So just, all the ingredients for life are there. It's got liquid water, organic molecules, energy flows thanks to the tidal heating from Jupiter at the tug of war between Jupiter and the other three moons. So it's really not difficult to imagine hydrothermal vents on the seafloor of Europa that are analogous to those on Earth's seafloors. Now, these hydrothermal vents fuel extremely rich ecosystems with many different kinds of creatures in complete absence of sunlight. So, excuse me, this is really, really intriguing. So NASA is planning a mission in the early 2030s called Europa Clipper. It's not going to orbit Europa. It'll be a Jupiter orbiter, but it'll be put in a trajectory in orbit where it will fly by Europa 44 times over several years. So it'll be able to image almost the entire surface at high resolution. It'll be able to measure the ice thickness, so scientists can identify where it is relatively thin. It will also fly through the plumes and measure their composition. And what I'm hoping is that your mission, the Europa Clipper, will pave the way someday for a Europa lander, land on the surface and either punch its way or meld its way, deploy some kind of probe that can get through the ice, get into the ocean, see what's there, and look for signs of life. This would be an incredibly exciting mission, but it's probably still a long way off. My guess is probably the 2040s at the earliest. I don't know if I'm going to get to live to see it. I just want to mention too, there's also other worlds of the outer solar system, like Enceladus. Here we see the dark streaks also produce plumes that might also have water oceans. Even Pluto probably has a water ocean. So there could be large numbers of these icy worlds in the outer solar system that have some form of life. And I want to conclude the solar system part by just talking briefly about Saturn's largest moon, Titan, which is actually bigger than Earth's moon. It's the only moon in the solar system that has a thick atmosphere. And that atmosphere has actually got a lot of similarities to Earth, both in terms of composition and pressure. We know from Cassini data, there are lakes and rivers on the surface where the liquid is not water, but liquid methane. And methane, of course, is an organic compound, as I discussed earlier. The problem with Titan is that its temperature on the surface is minus 290 degrees Fahrenheit, which might be too light for life as we know it. But place definitely worth exploring. There could be hydrothermal areas. There might be a subsurface water. Let's go there and see what's there. So NASA has approved an incredibly exciting rotorcraft mission, basically robotic helicopter called Dragonfly, that's scheduled to launch in 2026, land in 2034. Well, I shouldn't say land, fly in 2034, and will fly in Titan's thick atmosphere and see what's there, explore its atmosphere, surface composition, geological processes. This is, of course, an extremely technologically challenging mission, but if it works, we could find evidence for life 2.0, non-water-based life, or even if it doesn't find evidence for life, help scientists better understand, prebiotic chemistry, help them get a better understanding of the origin of life. So now I want to move to the outside the solar system, to exoplanets. Now, just about an hour ago, right before I logged in, I checked the website that to me is the record, called exoplanet.eu. And as of just, an hour ago, there are 4,360 known planets. That is 545 times more planets than we have found in the solar system. So our galaxy, as I mentioned earlier, has hundreds of billions of planets, perhaps 1 trillion, and you add in moons, enormous numbers of worlds out there. But even the closest exoplanet is 4.2 light years away. The closest known planet, well, it's got to be the closest planet. That's 25 trillion miles. So we're not going to visit them anytime soon. So you might be wondering, like, how can we know if they have planets? And this diagram shows how astronomers are currently probing the atmospheres of exoplanets. As I think most of you know, several thousand, most of these known planets cross in front of their stars. So they transit their host stars. As they transit their host star, some of the star's light passes through the upper atmosphere of the planet. And so you can observe the star when the planet is in transit and when it's out of transit. And you'll see an extra component in the spectrum of the star from molecules and elements in the upper atmosphere absorbing starlight. Like you can get a spectrum like we see on the right. So these spectral lines could reveal chemical indicators of life that are known as biosignatures. Now here we have kind of basic spectra of Venus, Earth, and Mars, kind of like what would be seen from, let's say we have civilizations maybe 10 or 20 light years from Earth, and they could get spectra of Venus, Earth, and Mars. This is kind of what they would see. Now, Earth would immediately jump out to them. They would see that O3 line, that's ozone, free oxygen. They'd see the carbon dioxide, and they'd see the water vapor. The key with oxygen, a highly reactive element that would not remain in Earth's atmosphere for more than a few centuries unless it's constantly replenished. And of course, on Earth, it's constantly replenished by photosynthesis. And the key too with oxygen, remember on Mars, it's just a few parts per billion. On Earth, oxygen is 21% of our atmosphere. So it is by no means a trace gas. It produces a very, very strong signature that would tell alien astronomers there's a lot of oxygen on this planet, and it's really intriguing that there's also water and CO2 there. With Venus and Mars, they would see CO2 dominated atmospheres. They'd say these two planets are a lot less interesting for biology because there are so many different processes like volcanism that can produce CO2. So they would be really, really interested in Earth. There's also another thing that we could see on other planets, or what are called, it's called disequilibrium chemistry, where you see a combination of chemicals that really should not exist together in the atmosphere. Like they would chemically destroy each other, which would indicate that they have to be constantly be replenished. And biology could become a very compelling explanation. So this is what astronomers are going to be looking for in the coming decades. So astronomers have already used this transit method I've discussed to discover dozens of different chemicals in exoplanet atmospheres. And this includes stuff like water vapor and CO2. But it's generally thought that it's going to require the next generation of telescopes to really find biosignatures. So the good news is that these next gen telescopes are just around the corner. NASA's scheduled to launch the James Webb Space Telescope just a little over a year from now with its 6.5-meter mirror, and it's optimized for infrared observation, so it could reveal things like water, ozone, methane, CO2 in exoplanet atmospheres. Already there's a very exciting target. There's a transiting system with 7 known planets called TRAPPIST-1, 40 light years from Earth. Now you have to look, there's a little, see that thin line where it said in large star size or large 25 times? These planets orbit incredibly close to the star, but the star is a very low luminosity red dwarf. 3 of those planets, E, F, and G, lie within the habitable zone of the star, meaning they're getting about the same amount of energy from the star that Earth gets from the sun. So this is going to be a target for JWST when it launches. There's also a trio of very large Earth-based telescopes, ground-based telescopes coming online between 2025 and 2030. And Mario can salivate, he's got a really nice 1-meter home observatory, but here we have a 30-meter telescope, a 24.5-meter telescope, and a 30-meter telescope. They're going to be on mountaintops, with very good observing condition. So they're going to be, these are the 30-meter telescope, the Giant Magellan telescope, and the European Extremely Large Telescope. Now, because they're on Earth's surface, they're going to be doing optical, visible light wavelengths, a little bit into the near infrared, but they're going to actually have better instrumentation than JWST. So some of the scientists I've interviewed think these telescopes, not JWST, are going to be better bets for finding life. They're going to be looking for things like oxygen 2, oxygen 3, and water vapor. And some of the scientists are saying if life is common, if like a lot of planets have life, one of these telescopes, or probably all 3, are going to start detecting them like within the next 10 years. So like this is unbelievably exciting, I think. There's also telescopes in the works. This is one of them called ExoLife Finder, ELF. They're going to be specifically designed for exoplanet studies. This one is going to use a complex system to cancel out a very complex coronagraph system that can cancel out the light of the parent star, which is roughly going to be 1 million times brighter than any planets that are orbiting it. So you can get really good information about the planet itself. Not only can you just look at the upper atmosphere, you can look at the entire planet. You can image the surface, see if there's oceans and continents, look for signs of vegetation, and get very, very high quality spectra. So this telescope, if it gets built, is not going to just be limited to transiting planets. So one of its prime targets will be, we know there are 2 planets orbiting the nearest star to the sun, Proxima Centauri. We know virtually nothing, this planet, it does not transit. It was studied by radial velocity because of the way it tugs on its star. But we know it's about 1/20th the distance from the star that Earth is from the sun, so about 0.05 AU. But because Proxima is a red dwarf, that's in the habitable zone. So that's going to be a really exciting target. Now, astronomers what they really would like to do is build a much bigger, large space-based telescope that could really perform ultra cutting edge exoplanet studies. So the one that's on the drawing board right now is called LUVOIR. It's not going to launch for probably the late 2030s, but depending on the funding, it would either be a 15-meter or an 8-meter telescope. If this thing is built and if light and it works according to spec, and if life is common in the galaxy, this'll find biosignatures. Whether this gets built or when, it's going to be more a function of politics than science, and how much funding, NASA, the Europeans, or maybe the Chinese are willing to give to something like this. It's going to be an expensive mission. So the final part of my talk, let me just get a little hit of water. And this is the kind of the crazy part of the talk, is about SETI, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, but I want to expand the signature, or expand the discussion to what are called techno-signatures, which would be signs of advanced civilizations that are modifying their planets or space environments in ways that our advanced telescopes could detect. Maybe they don't want us to detect them, but we could detect their technology. So that's something that's being thought about at a pretty deep level. Of course, with SETI, there's been SETI experiments since the early 1960s. I want to emphasize SETI is only a tiny part of what radio astronomers do. Of course, most of these experiments are done with arrays or telescopes like the one we see here, looking for radio signals. And a lot of SETI is now done piggybacking on just regular radio astronomy observations of stars and galaxies. The most advanced SETI project right now is called Breakthrough Listen. It's funded by this businessman at the upper left named Yuri Milner, who's a billionaire. It's using these 2 large radio telescopes, Green Bank and Parkes. These are both my photos, by the way. I have visited both of them. Just a few weeks ago, the project released data on 300,000 stars. No confirmed signals, but it's really gearing up. Now, of course, SETI's been around a while. We have no confirmed signals, but it's barely scratched the surface. Someone did a calculation recently that it's like searching the water in a bathtub versus the water in all of Earth's oceans combined. So the lack of a signal to date is not telling us anything interesting about the prevalence of other civilizations. So these searches are ongoing. The receivers are getting better. They can sift through millions of channels, narrowband channels simultaneously. So if there are other civilizations out there, if they're sending out radio waves, maybe someday one of these projects will hit the jackpot. Another route that's being pursued, especially by a group in California, and there's also a group that was doing this at the Oak Ridge Observatory in Harvard, Mass, by Paul Horowitz, looking for laser signals from other civilizations. So I just read recently the group in California, they're working on a telescope and equipment that could actually do an all-sky survey for pulse signals less than a billionth of a second long. Nature doesn't produce pulse light signals less than a billionth of a second long. So if you start seeing them, you're probably seeing an extraterrestrial civilization. But if we discover other civilizations, I'm going to put my money on the serendipitous discovery of technosignatures. So I want you to look at all the different objects in this slide. Unfortunately, Neptune and Pulsar at the Crab Nebula are kind of covered up on the right, at least on my screen. All of these objects were discovered serendipitously. In other words, they were discovered by astronomers who weren't looking for these phenomenon. So I think it could, what happened is, like with sunspots and Saturn's rings, you get a telescope, suddenly something that you don't really see naked eye comes into view. Ceres, you get like better telescopes, Ceres comes into view. These are all things that once we had better instruments, suddenly they come into view. We discover these things, we weren't expecting to find them. That could very well be how we discover extraterrestrial intelligence. So the idea here is that there could be civilizations out there, millions of years more advanced than us, that are engaging in astroengineering projects that might become visible to our telescopes once we cross a threshold of certain technological development. So here's just kind of a speculative example, is a space colony orbiting a black hole. Now, we're a long way from being able to do this, but who's to say a civilization that's far ahead of us wouldn't be capable of doing it? It might like to put a colony right around the black hole at a safe distance and tap the rotational energy of the black hole, which could power, a very advanced space colony. So consider humanity. Back in 1620, the Plymouth Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. How could they have predicted anything about what we humans would be doing 400 years later? If you went back in time and visited them and told us what we'd be doing, they would probably burn you at the stake. So here's ELF that I showed you a few minutes ago. It could, for example, discover chlorofluorocarbons or artificial compounds in the atmosphere of an exoplanet. It could find compounds that are clearly artificially produced, that nature does not produce. And then one of the team members, Jeff Kuhn of the University of Hawaii, told me because it can image the surface, including in the infrared, it could find the thermal emissions of cities from a civilization, cities on the night side of the planet. So I thought this is a wonderful piece of space art here, depicting an alien city. And an idea that really goes way back are what are known as Dyson spheres, named after Freeman Dyson. We see him here at the upper left. He died earlier this year. He was 97 years old when he died. This was not an idea original to him, but he kind of popularized the idea that a highly advanced civilization could build a swarm. It could like disassemble planets and asteroids and turn them into little space colonies that orbit the star in, a huge sphere where it's capturing almost the entire radiant energy of the star. I mean, think of the sun. We capture an infinitesimal percentage of its total radiant energy. Imagine what, future human or, civilization could do that taps, let's say, 90% the energy of the sun. So this idea makes sense. It's something that extraterrestrial civilizations might be doing. And the nice thing is that we could conceivably detect these things right now. They're going to capture presumably maybe visible light, but they have to radiate, second law of thermodynamics, they have to radiate away that energy, and they're going to do it in the infrared part of the spectrum. So astronomers have actually looked using data from infrared telescopes to see if they've looked at individual stars and even entire galaxies, looking for the possible signature of a Dyson sphere. So far, nothing conclusive, but this is just, an example of one of many examples that astronomers have thought of technosignatures that we could detect with current or near future telescopes. Now, another idea, this was, at first I was kind of skeptical, but there's an astronomer at Penn State University, about a 2-hour drive from where I live, named Jason Wright, who's a very creative thinker. Now, he's not a wacko. He is a highly respected astronomer and astrobiologist. And he said, who knows, maybe another civilization visited the solar system long, long ago, left some things behind that we could someday find. And actually, this is not an idea original to him. Arthur C. Clarke with 2001, the book and movie. And here we have where a civilization left behind an artifact on the moon and discovered by human explorers once we start colonizing the moon. So we haven't really explored these other worlds of the solar system in detail. So if once we do, who knows what we might find. And Wright also pointed out that there could be active or derelict alien probes orbiting the sun right now. Now, how would we find them? They could be very small. They could be, maybe the size of a basketball or something. And they're highly advanced and sophisticated. How would we even know about them? Like, we would have to do a thorough exploration of the vast expanses of interplanetary space to reveal them. So I don't think this idea is crazy. If you accept the premise that other civilizations might exist, some of them might endure for millions of years. The first ones might have, arose maybe several billion years ago. We cannot rule out the possibility that Earth is being observed right now, and maybe someday we'll find something that tells us that we're being observed. Another idea, and when I first read about this, I'm like, okay, this is crazy, but I've been convinced that the idea is not crazy. And that's called the Silurian hypothesis. And that's the idea that humans are not the first indigenous civilization on Earth, that another civilization could have arisen tens or hundreds of millions ago. There was a recent paper published in Astrobiology by 2 respected astrobiologists, and this is a refereed, respectable journal, that pointed out, because of erosion and plate tectonics, a civilization that existed many millions of years ago, we might not have even found signs of it yet. Almost all traces of that civilization would be erased by erosion and plate tectonics, but maybe someday a geologist or a paleontologist, or who knows, just a fossil hunter might find something that's like, oh my God, we're not the first one here. Now, if you thought that idea is crazy, this is another thing that Jason Wright told me. Okay, this is a LiDAR, that's like light radar, of a city in Guatemala from the Mayan era that's, was only discovered in 2017. So, and literally these remains are lying just inches below the surface from a civilization that existed just 1,000 years ago, and we didn't even discover it until 2017. So think about that. I mean, you could even argue we really haven't even explored Earth all that thoroughly, for techno-signatures. So last couple slides. I think all of you would agree that a conclusive discovery of another civilization would be a really big deal, especially if that civilization is far more advanced than ours, which is highly probable. I think it would give us reason for optimism that maybe we can survive our technological adolescence. We can survive our nuclear dilemma. We can survive climate change. We might have a long future ahead of us. It might also answer the question if we can learn something about their society. Are they biological, or are they AI, artificial intelligence, which would give us maybe an indication that humans might have a post-biological future. And I think just, confirming the existence of another civilization might have profound ramifications in ways we can't predict, especially if we can find some detailed information about that civilization. And even if we just detect primitive organisms or plant life on another planet, that would be fascinating. It would give us insight into the origins and types of planets and environments that can support life, what kind of alternative life forms might be possible, what alternative types of environments can support life. And I would even argue, let's say we build these big telescopes, you know, the large ground-based telescopes, JWST, LUVOIR, we explore the solar system very thoroughly, and we don't find any signs of life. And maybe like 40, 50, 60, 70 years from now, it's pretty clear life is all that not that common. Even that would be an interesting result and might imply that something very rare happened here on Earth, and that might give us a little bit better motivation to better protect the life that's here. So I think that no matter what we find or don't find, the search for life on other worlds is going to tell us a lot about ourselves and our place in this wondrous universe. So I want to thank you for listening. And these are 3 books that I recently read, that all of which I very heartily recommend, and all of them are quite different from each other. But these are just 3 of many really good books out there about astrobiology. And so I will be happy to take questions.
All right, hang on. I've just asked everyone to unmute. When it gets down to Bill Waller, I know he'll start.
Could you go over a little bit about the mid-infrared excesses as possible technosignatures?
Yeah, and I'm glad, that's a great question, Bill. Thanks for asking. I'm not, you know, I don't know the real details of this, but I know that Jason Wright and other astronomers, they've looked at things like the 2-mass infrared data. They've also looked at from NASA's WISE satellite, and what they're interested in is infrared signatures where you have a star that kind of has a very weird spectrum that sort of looks like, not like it's a bright infrared source, but it sort of has a spectrum that looks very different. And they've looked at kind of, you know, fairly bright stars in the infrared, also thinking about nearby stars. And then the other thing they've done, and I find this really interesting, is they've said, okay, well, what would happen if you had a galaxy with a super civilization that has colonized like millions or billions of stars in a galaxy and built Dyson spheres around lots and lots of stars, how that would kind of really alter the spectrum of the entire galaxy. And they've actually looked at WISE data, the WISE satellite, I think, what was it, Wide Infrared Survey Explorer, and they've actually analyzed that data set for entire galaxies, looking for something that looks really has a really unusual infrared signature. I don't know the details of what that signature would look like, but I can at least give you those general terms of what they're looking for. And so far, they have not found anything that jumps out at them and said, okay, that's, you know, artificial or technological, but they're going to keep looking.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it's this Kardashev scale, supposedly. We're 0.7 on the Kardashev scale.
They're looking for like type 2 and type 3 civilizations.
Right.
Yeah, type 2, like that. I'm glad you brought that up. They're looking for like a type 1 civilization is like one that harnesses all the energy of its planet and the radiant energy that the planet intercepts from the star. I think I'm remembering this correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. A type 2 civilization harnesses the entire energy of its star. So that's what a Dyson sphere would be, harnessing the energy of its star. A type 3 civilization is one that can harness like vast amounts of energy from the entire galaxy of billions of stars. So this infrared search is looking for a type 2 or type 3. And as Bill said, we're like a 0.7 meaning we haven't quite reached a type 1 civilization yet. We're getting there, but we haven't quite gotten to 1.0 yet. Did I get that right, Bill?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Bob, could I get you to stop sharing the screen so we can see each other here?
Okay, sure. Yeah. How do I, let's see. And show.
At the top of your screen, there should be a red button.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, we're good. Yeah. And if I need to go to a slide again, if someone asks a question, I can go back. And I mean, I took a lot of slides out, so I didn't go on for like 3 hours, which I think you guys would appreciate.
Bob, what would you guess would be the proportion of resources devoted to looking for technological signatures versus looking for biology? Because, you know, this whole technological thing could just be a stage in our evolution as an organism. So there's nothing to say that, I mean, Darwin would shriek if you said that we're heading inexorably toward high technology.
Right. Yeah, and that's an interesting question, Mike, because we don't really know what the future, you know, this, especially when I mean, life itself is a very speculative topic when you talk about life on other planets. And when you get to civilizations, I mean, you know, these books that I read about SETI and, you know, like the contact paradox, you can imagine civilizations, you know, that do kind of build Dyson spheres or build colonies around black holes. And those are the ones that might become observable to us. Even if they don't intend to be observable, we could observe them. But then you could have other civilizations that go in a very different direction that just says, you know, we want to, you know, become like philosophers and, you know, kind of scale back the technology, just kind of live in harmony with our planet and go in a completely different direction. And here's something else. You could have intelligent species like dolphins that live in these ocean worlds that maybe are incredibly intelligent, but don't ever really develop technology because they don't have the anatomical ability to build tools. Like dolphins can't build tools. They can't start fires, even though they could, you know, they're fairly intelligent and maybe could evolve even more intelligence over time. So there are so many different routes that civilizations could take. And my guess is that some do destroy themselves I mean, I think we're sort of heading in that direction ourselves. I actually think the nuclear threat's still our biggest threat. I read stuff about it that sends shivers up my spine, that if the public knew about this would be much more concerned about it than they are. You know, I think intelligent life could take so many different pathways, and that's why I think like the discovery would be serendipitous because we don't really know what the observational signatures would be of highly, highly advanced civilizations that are way beyond us, just as the Pilgrims just a couple hundred years ago couldn't have predicted how like humanity would evolve and what's happened, you know, with Earth. I mean, even 100 years ago, the predictions of life 100 years in the future were way, way off. We don't even know what life is going to be like here on Earth 100 years from now. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Digs into it pretty well, yeah.
Okay.
You know, what we're doing right now, 100 years ago, this would be flying cars for sure.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, and here's something really interesting about the moon landing. This was something I read in Arthur C. Clarke book, is you can go back to like Jules Verne, and there were science fiction people projecting that someday humans would walk on the moon. But if you go back to like Jules Verne, he wasn't predicting that 1 billion people would watch it live on television. So it's kind of fun. And you go back to Star Trek, the original Star Trek series from the 60s, its depiction of computer technology in the 23rd century is already more primitive than the computer technology we have right now. In other words, the computer technology went vastly faster than what Gene Roddenberry envisioned in the 1960s. I mean, we have better computers than that were flying on the Starship Enterprise, you know, with Captain Kirk. Whenever I watch that show, You know, I almost laugh at how primitive the computer is on the Starship Enterprise, because, you know, my my laptop computer that I'm doing this on right now is way more sophisticated than the computer on the Starship Enterprise, which I think tells us how difficult it is to predict future technological developments.
Sure, look at the communicators.
Oh yeah.
They're not even a StarTAC.
That's right. They look like a joke to us now. They look pathetic. They look pathetic, and that's supposed to be 23rd century technology? Come on.
I see we got at least one flip phone there, Barry.
Okay, yeah, okay.
I got one too.
Any other questions for Bob?
This will be my last. What about the arrow of complexity? Does it necessarily go towards increasing complexity in terms of evolution?
Well, that's another great question. Thank you. On Earth, there's no doubt that it has, but that arrow of complexity has gone very, very slowly. Now, I mentioned early in the talk that there's evidence for life going back. The really clear, conclusive evidence where we have like fossil life forms goes back about 3.5 billion years, rocks in Greenland and Western Australia. So the Greenland rock that I showed you, that's isotopic, like C13 to C12 ratio. Pretty though, you know, probably due to life. Now, what's interesting is that life could have started even earlier, but the signs of it would have been erased during the late heavy bombardment period. So we don't know when life started, but we know that when we could start seeing evidence for it, we start seeing evidence for it. But this is kind of the sad thing, is from what we can tell from the fossil record, is for several billion years, the life remained very primitive, single cell, prokaryotic life. And then eventually we got eukaryotic life with a more complex nucleus. And then it got even more complex once you started, probably through symbiosis, you started to get multicellular organisms. But that wasn't until fairly recently, maybe about I don't remember exactly when, but you know, about 1 billion years ago. So it took most of Earth's history just to get to like multicellular life. And then around a few, like I'm trying to remember the numbers, but around 600 or 700 million years ago, there's a fauna called the Ediacaran fauna. And that's when you start getting animal life, but it's very simple. It's like sponges and things like that. And then it was right after a snowball Earth phase ended, about 530 million years ago, bang, biology's big bang, called the Cambrian explosion. And then in a very short period of time, you got all sorts of very complex plant and animal life. And that's when like the modern Earth as we know it today started to really emerge, was about 530 million years ago. But that took a long time. You know, that's like 80 or 90% of Earth's history before you started really getting complex life, you know, where the arrow of complexity really started to take off. But once it took off, I mean, it really took off in a big way. The biodiversity, at least of macroscopic plant and animal life, exploded. Now, 5 times we've had mass extinctions, but in every case, life recovered very quickly and once again exploded in complexity and diversity. Now, so it's been kind of a slow process on Earth. I do want to mention one other thing, though, in response to Bill's question. The article I wrote for astronomy.com, which is online, you could find it on their website right now. There's an idea that was a cover story a few years ago in Scientific American that Earth is not necessarily the most habitable type of planet in the galaxy. And the article was written by a couple astrobiologists who argue, I think kind of persuasively, imagine a super Earth, maybe a planet maybe 2 to 3 times the mass of Earth, orbiting a K star. Okay, the planet is going to have bigger surface area, more internal heat. There's a lot of reasons to think that those types of planets might, on Earth, you have large parts of Earth's surface that don't have a lot of life, like dry deserts, areas like, for example, the oceans that don't have much oxygen. There's parts of Earth, you always find life everywhere you look on Earth, but there's parts of it where the life is very sparse. On a super Earth, you could have a planet with more surface area than Earth, but with that's entirely habitable. Like, because the poles are going to be warm, you can have a thicker atmosphere. You could have a stronger magnetic field to shield the atmosphere. So, and if you have a K star, you have a star that's going to be, on the main sequence for a much longer period of time than Earth. So you could have planets out there where maybe instead of taking 3 billion years to go from very simple life to complex life, maybe it goes fast forward, and that arrow of time, that arrow of complexity that Bill was mentioning, goes much, much faster. We don't know, but I think that's a fascinating possibility. And why should Earth? We're not special. Why should Earth be, it's certainly habitable. It's been habitable for 3.5 billion years, but there's nothing that says that Earth is the most habitable type planet in the universe or even in our galaxy. Does that all make sense, Bill?
Pretty cool.
Bill, we need
Actually
to talk
like that
about
idea.
evolution and teleology, some other forum.
Yeah, that's right. It could be totally different kind of life, and it, of course, would be adapted to its environment. And a super Earth, just like Earth, would have vastly different types of environments, including environments of which we don't have on Earth.
Bob, Star Trek does have us beat in one way, medical care. I'm waiting
Yep.
for a tricorder.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Yeah, but even like there's now medical scanners,
And
right?
there's no insurance forms show you how really advanced they are.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with you there, Mario. I would agree with that. Yeah. And I've read books though that say that the tricorder in Star Trek has actually inspired some like medical technology development, that some of the technologies that researchers have developed, as kids they were growing up watching Star Trek.
Well, the MRI was invented by someone at MIT.
Okay,
At Tufts Medical, right here.
And did he
Somebody
win the
waved
Nobel
at
Prize for that?
my face earlier this week and knew exactly whether I had a fever or not. So we're getting there.
Okay. And by the way, I was very excited both with the chemistry and the physics Nobel Prizes. I thought they were very deserving award winners. The physics, of course, was Roger Penrose for doing the calculations in the 1960s that show that collapsing stars can produce black holes. And then Andrea Ghez and Reinhard Genzel won their prize. They shared the other half for incredible observations showing the orbital motion of stars orbiting the black hole at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And then the chemistry prize, they should have won this 3 or 4 years ago, was Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna for discovering this CRISPR gene editing technique that I think is going to be a profound technology that's going to shape our future, hopefully more for the better than for the worse. But I knew that it was only a matter of time before they won the Nobel Prize. Would you agree with that, Mario?
Absolutely.
Yeah, incredible
You can't pick
discovery.
up a medical journal now without an article that was managed by CRISPR.
Wow. Okay. Really important. Yeah. Technology. Let's see. Any other questions? I'm happy to take some more.
Back to Enceladus. Do you know if they have any plans on how to bore through the ice sheet?
The original version of this talk, I said a little bit more about Enceladus, but the problem is right now NASA, or either NASA nor ESA, has a mission planned right now for Enceladus. Now for Europa, you know, it's definitely been discussed how you would penetrate, because probably at most places on Europa, the ice is going to be very thick, like miles thick. We don't really know though. So I don't think they're going to really seriously think about how to do it until we get Europa Clipper, which will then tell us how difficult the problem is going to be. It's going to do like these gravitational measurements that'll give us a good indication of the internal structure and where the ice might be at its least thick. So I know there's been thought about like using some kind of radioactive probe that could just melt through, or some kind of very high power drill, but it's going to be, it could be a very, very difficult technological problem to solve unless there are places where the ice is relatively thin. That's going to be the key. But there's also, this is the good news, clearly there's material from below that's making it to the surface, because they think that those cracks that have dark material, that some of that is, you know, material from the ocean that's somehow making it to the surface. So you could also study surface material, you know, to see if there's any kind of signs of life in these, you know, from this dark material in the cracks. But what they would really love to do is get down into that ocean. And by the way, the Enceladus Ocean is probably the ice, like the Enceladus is farther away, as you know, because it orbits Saturn instead of Jupiter. But the ocean, the ice shell is probably a lot thinner than the ice shell on Europa. So it might be eventually, Enceladus might be the better place to explore. We just don't know right now. But I want this to happen in my lifetime.
Any other questions for Bob? All right, well, let me take this minute to thank you, Bob. This was
Thank
a
you.
really terrific night. Thank you.
Okay.
Applause, applause, applause.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I appreciate
And,
everybody tuning in on a nice, at least here where I live, it's a nice clear evening, and Mars is right out my front door. And I got a great look and even got some decent handheld camera photos of the conjunction a few days ago. So that was fun.
All right. Well, thanks again. And next month, we've got Phil Urbanes talking about Einstein's block universe.
Oh, wow.
So tune in for that. And thank you again to Bob, and thank you for everybody for showing up. And if there's no more questions, I'm going to turn the lights out.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Mike.
Thanks for coming,
This is
Michael.
going to
Thank
be
you.
online.
Thanks, Bob.
This is going to be online on our journal, the Galactic Inquirer, and I will send you a link, Bob.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
And
All
I'll be
right.
giving this same talk in just a couple weeks to the Hershey Public Library, my hometown library.
Perfect.
All
Yeah.
right. Terrific. I'm going to email you, Bob. I have another question
Okay.
for you.
Okay, great. I'll
All
look.
right.
check
Good night,
that.
everybody.
Thanks,
Good night,
Bob.
everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Bob.
Mike.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.